Yes, it is. Okay. Right, so obviously I felt I had to begin by mentioning the two horrific incidents that we've had to face this week. Firstly, with the attack on LGBT community in Orlando, which has left us absolutely reeling, and then the brutal murder following those mass murders of Jo Cox MP when she was campaigning in her constituency. And I think the two things that I wanted to just say from that, from the most recent, was that I picked up something from Jo Cox that I've often said about the relationship between trade unions and the Labour Party, and she used it in her maiden speech in the House of Commons just last year. So while we celebrate our diversity, what surprises me time and time again as I travel around the constituency is that we are far more united and have far more in common with each other than the things that divide us. And I think if we can keep that in our minds going forward, of course there are things that divide us, of course there are times we disagree, and of course there are times when it feels like the end of the world of a particular issue. But the trade unions and the Labour Party working together have achieved fantastic things and important things and could achieve so much more. And that's why I think keeping that in my mind. The other one was something that was quoted by her husband, who talked about the need to unite to fight against the hatred that killed Jo Cox, and I would say also the people in Orlando. Hate doesn't have a creed, race or religion, it is poisonous. And I think if we could find a way to unite people against that form of hatred, that is a big alliance. That is a big alliance that we could bring together. But I don't think we're there yet. And I think there's a huge way to go before we can feel like there's that sense of community that we would all want, where everybody is in a position that that kind of hatred and linked to far-right organisation that appears to be being exposed now, that is having that kind of influence in our community. So I am a lifelong trade unionist, for longer than obviously it looks, as Maria said. But I believe that the trade union relationship between the trade unions and the Labour Party was trade unions and others coming together that set up the Labour Party, because so many things that you want to change, you can't change just by action in the workplace, and you can't change just by action in the community alone. You need political change, either because you've got laws coming at you that make it impossible for you to do what you want to do, like the Trade Union Act, as one example, or because you need those positive rights, positive messages, positive organising possibilities that come from the laws that can come in, that can enable the sorts of things that we need. And so, I mean, I was thinking coming here about the fantastic support that there was at one time because of trade unions and Labour working together for trade union education, the funding that there was. I did a lot of work in trade union education in the early days of my involvement. I absolutely passionately believe in it. And I know that when you're scrabbling around for funds, of course, that's the kind of thing that comes under threat. But we should never, ever underestimate the importance of union education and the doors it opens for people who've had education doors slammed in their faces. So I'm very, very committed to that. And I think that going forward, we have to look at making sure that a Labour manifesto includes support for union education very, very strongly. But the impact of the cuts on further and higher education, the impact of the cuts on education in general, is what we also need to organise against. I think when I got organised, I worked in a sector where there wasn't a union. And I was a young person in a workplace. I could see things that were wrong. I also could see it was a place where people weren't used to the idea of being in a trade union, but we got organised. And I think that's the confidence that I think I want young people to feel empowered to today, because now we're coming across a whole load of new attacks on working people that are coming from different ways of working. Zero-hour contracts has been talked about a lot with the Sports Direct example. But I was just reading today about crowd work on top of Uberisation, which in my responsibilities, I cover the transport sector, so I'm obviously seeing a lot of that firsthand. But every day there's something new. I always say to trade unionists, whatever part they're playing in the union, and particularly new people, you are the expert in your experience of work, and this trade union is weakened if we don't have that knowledge and that experience in there driving it, and absolutely it's weakened if you're not standing as a rep and you're not getting involved. I was listening to the debate earlier, and I think I want to also say that we need to have protection for our shop stewards and union reps so that they aren't identified. We've had the blacklisting case that's been won recently. These are absolutely essential basic protections, because if we're going to have any kind of decency in our workplaces, we've got to have people confident to tackle the problems that are there, to raise the issues without fear of losing their job and without fear of being victimised or violently attacked even in certain cases. So, and that's worldwide, not just in this country, because as long as we allow any part of the world that kind of treatment to happen to workers, then all of us are undermined by it. So trade unions obviously can make a difference for individuals, and they can make a difference for collectives as well, and that's essential. But if we don't have the link with the political party, there are limits to what we can achieve through trade union action alone. So I just wanted to look at a few of the achievements of trade unions and the Labour Party, looking backwards, that we want to take for granted, and that I'm fearful, with all the current debates that are going on, we can't take any of them for granted, because they will all be up for grabs. But just the basics of the Health and Safety at Work Act, what were the Sex Discrimination, Race Relations, Equal Pay Act, sexual orientation, religion, belief, and so on, all of those that are now in the Equality Act, those issues that we want to be able to take for granted, we can't if we've got a government in there that starts to chip away and dismantle them. Also, I suppose, none of these were given to us on a plate, and I know everyone will know the frustrations of that. Just taking the national minimum wage, for example, 1998, that came in. It was 1910 where the women chainmakers had the first successful strike on a minimum wage. There was a minimum wage, but it wasn't enforced. And they took strike action, and they won. They did much more than just take strike action. They did a lot of linking and international campaigning and all sorts of things. But they got the principle of a minimum wage established. And it took all that time after that, all the other struggles that there'd been, for people to finally accept that there needed to be legislation, not so it becomes a maximum, of course, but it's got to be the minimum floor. And there are all those debates to continue. But I think everybody realised that having no floor on pay, it was possible it could plummet so low that there were employers that were prepared to employ people in the most horrific way without that minimum floor. Of course, as trade unionists, we want to feel that we're organising everywhere and preventing that from happening through our activity. But the reality was, workers were slipping through that net, and that's why that safety net ultimately became one that the whole trade union movement fought for. But I think just because we've got the link with the Labour Party and we've got that important link does not mean that things are automatic. They have to be organised for, they have to be fought for, they have to be won. But without a party that's prepared to engage in that, we have the problems that we've got at the moment. I mean, I mentioned transport. We take the bus services bill, which is coming through, which has the good side of potential re-regulation of the bus industry, which is an absolute shambles at the moment. However, it includes a clause that says that although municipal bus companies that exist are doing a good job, there will be no more. We will prevent any other local authority from setting up and running its own municipal bus company, basically preventing publicly running of bus services. So I was really delighted at a meeting we'd organised to have Lillian Greenwood, the Shadow Transport Secretary, say, firstly, that Labour is going to oppose that clause, and secondly, when Labour wins the next election, therefore they will have on the agenda, if it does go through, to repeal it. And I think that's the kind of relationship and understanding that you want going through. So I'm going to do a quick mention of our fair transport petition on the back of that, which is, this is collectively with trade unions across Europe, calling through a European Citizens Initiative to the European Union, I know you've had a debate about that earlier, to say that we want fair conditions for transport workers and no allowing of social dumping and undermining from country to country. And so all it says is that you want fair conditions for transport workers across Europe. We have, as well as trade unions supporting this, got the support of the Labour Shadow Frontbench team to support it, and Jeremy Corbyn is also going to support that. So I think despite from time to time our differences on policies, I think the relationship between trade unions and the Labour Party is most important. It's good for trade unions and for trade unionists, and it's good for the Labour Party. It links it properly into workplaces, into working class communities, in a way that otherwise it is shut off from. I think I was hearing people talking earlier about ensuring, and obviously part of, I think, Jeremy Corbyn's message is that we want to be a party, we want a Labour Party that is more representative of the people that it serves. There's currently various consultations going on within the Labour Party to look at what do we need to change so that we have better working class representation in politics. What do we need to change so that more young people are coming forward? What do we need to change so that women are properly and fairly represented, so that Black, Asian and ethnic minorities are? And we would add to that so that disabled people are, and lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people are, because otherwise we haven't got a democracy that's properly representative of people. And that is absolutely essential. So on the policy side, I think at the last election, Labour had some really good policies that mostly people didn't know about. The kind of thing I get asked for example, is, well, I'm not sure about Labour. What are they doing about agency workers and the Swedish derogation? These are the kind of questions I get asked by people who are directly affected by it. Well, the answer is Labour was committed to closing all the loopholes in the agency workers legislation so that anybody employed by an agency would be entitled to fair equal treatment with the rest of the workforce. However, people didn't know that. It's not the snappiest thing to put on a slogan, and so that's the problem that we've got. You look in the book and you can find it, but it didn't come across that Labour was saying that about agency workers. And I think one of the things that is really changing with the current way in which the Labour Party is moving, obviously, firstly, the membership has more than doubled since the election, which is absolutely incredible, really amazing. And that's something which I think the party can be really proud of. The Labour Party now is made up of more members than the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP added together. So that is something that's very important, and just this week, in fact, we had a meeting of the Joint Policy Committee which brings together the shadow cabinet team with the National Executive Committee representatives and so on to just oversee the policy documents that are coming forward. And at that meeting, Jeremy Corbyn made a very, very strong plea that we have to look at making sure that the policy making properly reflects that growth in membership. And he said, my experience is going round, people want to contribute, they want their voices heard, they want people to know what the issues are. And unless you're in the know on how the policy making works, let's be honest, most people don't feel that they're engaged or that they can take part in that. Actually, the Labour Party has a totally open procedure. At the moment, it's just finished the second stage of the document, that any single person or organisation, whether they are affiliated to, part of or a member of anything to do with Labour, is entitled to post a comment on our consultation document, that I say our because we put them together jointly, on those consultation documents about their views and their comments, and then the policy commissions take all those on board in deciding the next stages. You can't have people who are from outside the party deciding everything. Ultimately, that goes to conference in the usual way. But the process is that trade unions, socialist societies, Labour Party members, constituencies, meetings can take part. So also can any other organisation and any other individual that wants to. And some of them do, but a lot of them don't, and probably don't even realise they could. So I think that Jeremy Corbyn is absolutely determined, because if people have taken part in the development of policy and they can see that they've been taken seriously in the issues they've raised, they may not get every single thing that they want. I think it was said once that you put in that you wanted for your birthday a bicycle and you got given a chemistry set, and you think, and sometimes policy can be a bit like that. You put in asking for one thing that you think will be really important and you get something else that's quite good but wasn't really what you had in mind. There is a bit of that frustration can happen, but the fact is, if you've been part of the development and you get the message and you've been taken seriously, you've been listened to, and the party changes as a result of that process, then there is a really important way forward on that. And trade unions and trade unionists have a very important role to play, because if it's just we get our policy documents out and send them in, none of the members of the trade union movement will be engaged or involved in any shape or form in that process, and they won't realise what's made a difference and what hasn't. So we have to look as well within the trade union movement about how we build that involvement and that knowledge. But the potential is there in that policy making process, alongside the safeguard of motions, which is also there, to do that. But there is a consultation going on about strengthening that process. At the moment, it's a take it or leave it process on the documents, and I think that does cause problems sometimes. So there's obviously a number of ways it could be improved, but the principles of it are positive and good and outward looking. I think the other thing I wanted to stress is the challenges facing workers and the challenges facing trade unionists at the moment, globally, nationally and locally, are so huge. I mean, the one statistic of Apple's finances exceed the GDP of 2/3 of the world's countries is just one example. I don't think you need me to give you all of those, but that economic model of undercutting, driving down standards in a relentless race to the bottom to squeeze out the most profit and take the least, give the least to people, has led to some absolutely horrendous things. And I think the evidence that was given on Sports Direct, even when people knew it was a problem, was still shocking. A woman forced to give birth in the toilets because she wasn't allowed to call the doctor. We've had similar things with strawberry pickers working in the fields. But it doesn't only happen to the least organised. I represented tanker drivers during the dispute a few years ago, and it seemed to be what we've ended up with out of that dispute. In the end, we didn't take a day's industrial action, but it was very close. But the national industrial action of tanker delivery drivers had to be threatened before you could get the government to recognise that the safety standards of how fuel was being distributed were being eroded daily. Now we got all the players, the government intervened and got everybody around the table, the oil companies, the retailers, as well as the employers and the unions, and we sat down together and we drew up a standard which now operates. Over 7,000 tanker drivers have that standard, and you don't load or offload fuel unless you have it. Actually, we had a lot of help from the FDU during the dispute, I will say, because you might remember Francis Maud suggested that people should store jerry cans in their garages to stockpile, which of course was the worst possible advice anybody could be given. I said we didn't take a day's industrial action. We didn't need to, because he made people start panicking anyway. The fact is, though, that even those very organised people, for something as basic as that, had to threaten a national strike and say enough is enough. So the same pressures are there everywhere. So I think my final message is that what we need to counter this has got to be big. I heard somebody earlier mentioning about global union federations. global union federations bringing together people across the world. We're involved in all of them in Unite because of where we're organised. I'm involved personally with the International Transport Workers Federation and the Union of Food Workers, and also the International TUC. And there are things that get achieved through those processes. But of course, because they're often in one particular country, you don't always know about it. But there are some really positive things that can be done through those ways of organising. So there are things about workers linking up across the world in trade unions, which is very important. But also, I think the message that I also heard people mentioning earlier about linking up in the community is vital. Unite has a community membership for that very reason, because we need those alliances. If people have lost their job, if they are, for one reason or another, it can be disability, it can be caring, it can be childcare, are not in paid work, or if they're volunteers, they still want to be linked into a trade union, and they want access to the world of work and the links that there can be there, and that is extremely positive. So I think a lot of the struggles that we are embarking on, you don't win on your own. You need to link up internationally, you need to link up in your local community. And my final example is actually in a very different experience, is the alliance that was formed to get rights for migrant domestic workers, who are the most vulnerable, the most isolated individuals, who in the 1990s, 1980s and 1990s, their immigration status was so precarious that when they came into the country, they got stamped on one side that they weren't allowed to work, and on the other that the only reason they were allowed in the country was because they were employed in a particular family. So they didn't exist as a person. They were not a worker, but on the other hand, they were the property of that family. So it's a form of slavery. So we got that changed by the Labour government in 1998 because of huge amount of campaigning. It was one of the first acts of the 1997 Labour government, for which, whatever else was done, I will always, always remember that bit of injustice and that slavery that was ended at that time. And we fought again in 2008 when it came under threat. But in 2011, through the organising of those most vulnerable people, and I tell you, the meetings of migrant domestic workers are some of the strongest and most powerful I've ever come across in the trade union movement. You walk into a room with over 200 migrant domestic workers. They come together regularly, usually on a Sunday, which is a day they don't work, but other than that, they do. And I always say, migrant domestic workers and lorry drivers contact you in the early hours of the morning. That's what they have in common. But that's when they turn to the union. It's the moment they get a bit of time to themselves. And so, but what we managed to do was to get across the International Labour Organisation a domestic workers' convention. And this country has not signed up to it. This country said it wasn't needed because we already had the overseas domestic worker visa. And then the coalition government undermined it, took away the rights, tied the employee back to the, tied the worker back to the employer. And so we have they reintroduced bonded labour in this country. So we're back on that campaign trail again. But we achieved that change through a massive alliance of quite unlikely people coming together. And those migrant domestic workers joined the union. In the early days it was the Transport and General Workers Union, now it's Unite. And they also have their own organisation, Justice for Domestic Workers, which is part of Unite, but which acts as a possibility for people who feel well away from the trade union movement to turn first to other people exactly like themselves and then to the rest of the trade union movement. And we're able to say, you might feel on your own and you might sometimes feel very alone behind closed doors as a migrant domestic worker, but you aren't. You have the strength of 1.5 million members of Unite, you have the strength of the 6.5 million members of the TUC, and in this case, you had the strength and support of the Labour government, and in opposition, Labour has also pledged to reinstate those rights again. So that relationship between Labour and the trade unions is vital, and we need to ensure, though, that it keeps one where it's independent but strongly linked, and the voices need to be listened to so that we get the right kind of policies that then people will support, they'll feel represent them, and what change we could bring about in this country. Thank you.